Chapter 21, Part 2, America and the Great War, 1914 to 1920. As stated in the PowerPoint for Part 1, the armistice to conclude the war was to be based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. These 14 points were drawn up by a group of individuals that Wilson highly regarded, and they became known as the Inquiry Committee. So Wilson did not dream up all of these on his own. The 14 points were really an idealistic vision that Woodrow Wilson had of ending war in the world. So World War I is sometimes referred to as the war to end all war. And though there are 14 points, we're not going to talk about all of those. We're just going to hit the highlights of the major points. The first one of these is no secret treaties. Open diplomacy, openly arrived at. This is because we really believe that one of the causes of the war had been those entangling alliances that had been started in Europe beginning in the 1890s. And so when the war started, instead of it just being an isolated conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, it spread to all of Europe and other parts of the world. So no secret treaties. Another one was no acquisition of territory. We felt that one of the reasons that the European countries kept going to war with each other was because after every war, the winner took land from the loser. So they said that this war is going to end and no one is going to gain territory because of that. Another one was national self-determination. We recognize that many of the ethnic groups in Europe, especially those that were under the control of those large empires like Austria-Hungary and Turkey, wanted to gain their independence. And really that was the root of why there was the assassination of the Archduke to begin with. So we said where territorial lines have to be redrawn, where empires have to be broken up, they will be based on national self-determination. What this means is that instead of the allies coming in and saying, we're going to recreate Austria-Hungary and we're going to divide it up, and this is the way we're going to do it, we would let the people in that region do it. So national self-determination. Another one was unilateral arms reduction. Everybody would have to reduce arms. By the time we get to the outbreak of World War I, there are huge arms buildups throughout Europe. And we felt like that was one of the causes of the war, that you had these huge arsenals, and so it's easy to go to war. So if you don't have weapons, you might try to resort to more diplomacy before declaring war. So unilateral arms reduction, everybody having to reduce our arms. Another thing that we felt would help cut down on war would be to recreate Poland. Poland had been a country, then it was taken over by Germany and Russia, and you know, throughout its history it is a nation on its own, and then it's taken over by other countries. But we felt that if Poland was recreated, it would create a buffer zone between Germany and Russia, who were traditional enemies. And so let's recreate Poland and put them between these two countries that don't like each other. And then the big one that Woodrow Wilson wanted was the League of Nations, an international peacekeeping body. He felt this was crucial to ending war, because this body could take on conflicts and could help these countries resolve their conflicts without going to war. The peace conference to end World War I was held in France at the Palace of Versailles. So it is called the Versailles Peace Conference. The Allied leaders that will be involved in the peace conference are known as the Big Four. Georges Clemenceau was the leader from France. He is the elder statesman, and he and Woodrow Wilson are actually going to have some difficulties during the war, during the peace conference, because Clemenceau wants to destroy Germany. He wants to make Germany so weak with this peace that Germany can never invade France again. Twice during his lifetime, Germany has invaded France because he was alive during the Franco-Prussian War. So he wants to destroy Germany. And of course, that goes completely against Woodrow Wilson's ideas of a fair and equitable peace. The British diplomat was David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George actually ends up being the mediator among the diplomats because he is trying to keep the peace between Clemenceau and Woodrow Wilson oftentimes. Many times he sides with the French and many times he sides with Woodrow Wilson. But his role is to keep them from like locking horns with each other. The Italians sent a representative, Victoriano Orlando, but the Italians came with the sole purpose that they wanted to gain 2 certain territories in the Mediterranean. And when it was decided that they could not have those territories, Orlando will actually just quit the peace conference and go home. So the Big Four becomes the Big Three. Woodrow Wilson broke precedent. He will attend the peace conference in person. He doesn't send the Secretary of State or the Vice President. He attends in person because he felt that he needed to be there, that no one else but he could get through the ideas of the 14 points. So we have some controversy there because he attends in person. We have controversy among the diplomats that are there because they don't all have the same ideas of what the peace should be. We also have some controversy because let's look at one of the allies who's not there. Russia is not there. If we will remember from our world history, in 1917, Russia had a revolution and overthrew the Tsar. And by the time we get to the peace conference, the communists have taken over Russia. And when Lenin and the communists took over Russia, they made a separate peace with Germany and got out of the war. So when the Versailles Conference is held, the attitude of the remaining allies was that Russia didn't need to come to the conference. They had made their own peace, and they were really angry with Russia for dropping out of the war early, and so they did not invite Russia to the peace conference. We will also see that while Germany is at the peace conference, they are not included in most of the negotiations. And that shows us that this is really going to be a dictated peace to Germany. Even though the Germans don't feel that they have been defeated in the war and they asked for an armistice, they did not surrender, they will be treated as a defeated nation. And the Big Three will basically come up with the terms of the treaty, and they will impose those on Germany. And Germany can either accept them or they will go back to war. And of course, Germany will decide that they cannot afford to go back to war, and so they will accept the terms. So let's look at the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So one of the big things that we see in the treaty is that Germany will have to give up all of its colonies everywhere. And this we would look at and we would say, well, maybe then that, that's not really that bad of a thing, that, that is one of the 14 points. But Germany's colonies were not granted their independence. Germany's colonies were given to other countries. Great Britain got some, France got some, even the Japanese got some, and they played a very minor role in the war. For example, if we go back and we think about when we were looking at Chapter 19, remember in Chapter 19, when we were talking about Samoa, the U.S. got half of Samoa and Germany got the other half. Well, after World War I, the British, who had wanted Samoa all along, remember, will actually get Samoa. So half of Samoa today is British Samoa and the other half is American Samoa. Germany will also be forced to pay huge war reparations. This was a tradition in Europe that the loser pays for the war. Sometimes in money, sometimes in land, sometimes both. After World War I, Germany will have huge war reparations imposed on them. They will have them set so high that the German economy can really never recover after World War I, which is going to push them into a depression early in the 1920s, well before our depression begins in the 1930s. The reparations also had to be paid in gold. And so this is going to really upset the German economy and really set them on the road to failure. And there's going to be a lot of problems in Germany after the war. Another issue that caused great tension in Germany after the war that was brought on by the peace conference and the treaty was the war guilt clause. There is a clause in the Treaty of Versailles that says Germany is solely responsible for the war. So in other words, we're saying that Germany started the war. It's their fault that there was a war. And of course, that's really simply not true. The war started because Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia after Serbia participated in the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So it was really the fault of a lot of people, a lot of causes for the war. But everyone wanted to blame Germany because Germany was feared for their military prowess, and you need to have a scapegoat. You know, it's not our fault, it's their fault kind of mentality. Germany will also be forced to demilitarize because of the war. There won't be unilateral demilitarization, only German demilitarization. Germany cannot have any forts or any types of fortifications along the Rhine River because that's where we're getting closer to France. Germany will have to greatly reduce the size of its army and navy, even to the point of scuttling or sinking some of their ships, with the idea of making Germany weaker so they cannot invade other countries in Europe, especially France. Poland will be recreated. Huge portions of Germany and Russia will be taken to create Poland. So that was one of the things that Woodrow Wilson wanted in his 14 points that he got. And the League of Nations was also, excuse me, included in the treaty. Any nation who signed and ratified the treaty would become a member of the League of Nations. So the international peacekeeping body was there. The Treaty of Versailles is really the worst of both worlds. It is not exactly what Woodrow Wilson wanted, and it's not exactly what Clemenceau wanted. It was tough enough on Germany to make them resentful, but not tough enough to prevent them from ever rising from the ashes and like the phoenix. It was not a fair and equitable peace. There were many pieces included in the treaty, like the huge war reparations and the war guilt clause, that caused great resentment and bitterness in Germany and great economic hardship in Germany. Because of that, we see that the effects of the treaty is that the new government for Germany, the Weimar Republic, is blamed for the treaty. When the war was over, mainly because Woodrow Wilson insisted upon it, Germany's leader, the Kaiser, had to resign and abdicate his throne, and then he went into exile in Norway. And the new government was a democratically based government called the Weimar Republic. And it is this Weimar Republic that signs and ratifies the Treaty of Versailles for Germany. Many people blamed the Weimar Republic for this unfair treaty, and so the government itself was never popular, and it really ensured that they would eventually fall, especially after the economic hardships began to grow and grow throughout the 1920s. We also see fringe groups beginning to emerge and become dominant players in German politics. The Communist Party gained a great deal of momentum in Germany right after the war. And also, of course, the National Socialist Party, which today we call the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party really started out as kind of a fringe group, but as the 1920s continued and the economic hardships in Germany continued, the Nazi Party became more and more popular, and also because Adolf Hitler emerged as the leader of the Nazi Party, and he was an eloquent speaker. He just was very dynamic, and he gained a lot of support for the movement, and he told the people what they wanted to hear. It's not our fault that we have these economic problems. It's the fault of the treaty. It's not our fault. It's the fault of the Jews. And so he found these scapegoats, and so it propelled him to become a huge national figure. And of course, eventually, by 1933, he will seize power in Germany. This map just shows us the before and after the Treaty of Versailles in World War I. And you can see how so many new little countries were created, like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Romania became much larger. Poland was recreated, taking lands both from Russia and Germany. And so Europe is going to look vastly different after the war than it did before the war. At home, Woodrow Wilson experienced great difficulties with the treaty. When Woodrow Wilson had gone to France to negotiate the treaty, he had not taken any members of the Senate with him to the conference. And of course, if you remember from your government classes, in America, the Senate has to ratify treaties. And so the Senate doesn't really feel like they have any stake in this treaty. And one of the big sticking points for most of the Senate was the League of membership, the League of Nations. They did not want to become part of the League of Nations because they were afraid that if the United States became part of the League of Nations, that we would be constantly dragged into European conflicts. And we don't want that. Most Americans wanted World War I to be a one and done. They wanted us to go, the war was over, we saved the world, and then we want to go back into isolationism. We want to go back to the way things were before the war. Henry Cabot Lodge was the leader of the Senate and the leader of the opposition to the treaty. And he met with Woodrow Wilson a couple of times, and he even proposed to Wilson that if they would take the League of Nations out of the treaty, he could get the Senate to approve the treaty. But that was the one thing Woodrow Wilson liked. That was the one thing he wanted. And so Woodrow Wilson said, no, the League of Nations stays in. So the treaty did not get ratified immediately. To help gain support for the treaty, Woodrow Wilson went on a public speaking tour across the country, trying to get the people to put pressure on the Senate. Woodrow Wilson was very popular, and it may have worked, except during the tour, Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke that was very debilitating, and he could not continue to push for the treaty. And so without him leading the charge, the Treaty of Versailles was never ratified. And that meant that the United States never became a member of the League of Nations, which pretty much sealed the fate of the League of Nations, that the League of Nations would be ineffective. They could not deal with the massive problems that are going to occur in that interwar period in the late 1920s and the 1930s, when Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese began to be very aggressive. How does the war end for the United States then? We basically made our own separate peace with Germany that just said that the war was over. When World War I was over, the United States did not go back to just being the normal, just going back to the way things were before. As a result of the war, we developed this fear of communism, and that really was sparked by that Russian Revolution in 1917 and the communists taking over. And so we had this fear that communism was going to spread and that the communists wanted to take over the world. And that's mainly because pretty much that's what Karl Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, that the workers of the world will unite and take over. And so what that parlayed into here in the United States was what we call the first Red Scare, where there began to be this really kind of witch hunt looking for communists in America. And we linked communism and we linked our fears of communism to labor unions and to foreigners in America, especially foreigners coming in from Eastern Europe. And this witch hunt mentality was really sparked by the Attorney General at the time, A. Mitchell Palmer. And Palmer had what they called the Palmer Raids, and they were really focused a lot on the labor unions. where they would raid these labor union offices and seize papers and materials that they felt were incriminating against the labor unions. For many years in our country, the labor unions have been associated with being anti-capitalism, if not pure out socialists, and so they were pretty much an easy target. Foreigners were seen as people that brought in these concepts that were anti-American, these communist ideas, these socialist ideas, and so foreigners began to be deported just for really being suspected of committing criminal acts. And so we do begin to see some pushback from some of these labor unions and these foreigners. We do see there is some violence that will occur, some riots and things of that nature. But eventually, right before Woodrow Wilson leaves office, he kind of calls Palmer in on the carpet and says, look, you can't just deport people and throw people in jail because you suspect them of something. You need to put up some concrete evidence against these individuals. And Palmer, of course, had no concrete evidence that labor unions were a communist force or that these foreigners were. And so eventually the first Red Scare will fade out of existence. The first Red Scare will not be to the volume that we'll see in the 1950s with the second Red Scare, but it is still, it's fueled by fear, it's fueled by ignorance of not knowing what the communists were and who was involved in those communist raids. And so we began to see communists behind every tree and attack those individuals. 1920 was a presidential election year, and because of his health, Woodrow Wilson could not run for re-election. He had already served 2 terms, but there was nothing to prevent him from running except his health in 1920. So the Democrats are greatly weakened. They have been blamed for the Red Scare. They were blamed for the failure of the Treaty of Versailles. And so the Republicans are going to once again feel like they have an opportunity to win the election. And they really ran on returning to normalcy. They refuted the Red Scare. They blamed that on the Wilson administration. They said they wanted to return to, the way things were before the war, America taking care of America, America taking care of American business. And the Republican candidate for the presidency was Warren G. Harding, who was a millionaire businessman. He had a little bit of an unsavory reputation. He was known to be kind of a ladies' man and had several affairs along the way. But his running mate, Calvin Coolidge, was a very highly respected individual who was above reproach in his moral character. Harding's administration was a short administration because he will die in office of a stomach disorder. But Harding, during the short time that he is in office, about a year and a half, his administration was saddled with scandals and charges of corruption. But when he died, Calvin Coolidge, of course, will take over the presidency. And as I said, many people really respected him. He was really above reproach in his moral character. His nickname was Silent Cal because he didn't talk a lot. He thought very much before he said things and made speeches. But during the Coolidge administration, we really do see a return to really business running the government, really kind of going back, overturning even many of the progressive measures that Teddy Roosevelt, who also was a Republican, had worked on. We return to that laissez-faire economics concept of government should stay out of business, let the businesses grow and develop on their own. We should not regulate them. That's not our place. He lowered taxes, mostly to encourage business growth. So he went back to many of those really old school Republican ideas, big business ideas. And one of the very famous quotes that we often identify with Calvin Coolidge is the quote that the business of America is business. And during the Coolidge administration, we do see great economic growth in our country. This is, of course, the age of the roaring 20s when we have great business expansion. And it seems like Coolidge is right until we get to the end of that 1920s decade. And this concludes our part 2 of the chapter 21 presentation. And our next chapter will be chapter 22, which is the Roaring Twenties.